Well, hi. We're back, this time with AP Euro for Unit 6, Assignment 13. We're going to be talking for a little while about improved public health conditions and just generally overall how the people in Europe in the mid-19th century were moved to try to improve living conditions in European cities. So we'll start with medicine. Up to the 19th century, typically you were lucky if a doctor didn't do more harm than good. Medicine was very primitive in many ways. You still had the maintenance of the old demonic idea of illness, that you were ill because you were possessed by satanic demons or evil satanic like spirits or what have you. And exorcism was commonly practiced to try to cure sick people. Obviously not real effective. You did have pharmacists, they were called apothecaries back then, who had sort of traditional herbal and folk remedies, some of which actually were beneficial, but often were harmful as well. You had surgeons who started out actually were barbers. Back in the medieval period, that's who did your surgery. They had the tools, the sharp tools, the razors and stuff. So you cut your hair, give you a shave, take out your appendix. You could run a 3-for-1 special. They operated without real anesthetic, and of course they didn't have a germ theory disease, so they operated in conditions that were horrific, and the risk of infection was through the roof because they didn't use sterilized instruments, and they certainly didn't operate in a sterilized operating room setting, so it was usually bad news. The common remedy practiced by physicians to cure somebody was bleeding. They had this belief that there were 4 humors in the body: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And that when someone was sick, it was because these humors were out of balance and someone had an excess of one or the other. So, following the logic of that, if you have an excess of blood, the way to make you better is get rid of some of the excess of the blood. So bleeding was very common. Blistering was very common. You lay a hot iron or a stone on the chest of the patient. It's a nice blister forms, then you lance the blister and the fluid drains out. You give them serious laxative to purge that way, all sorts of things. The downside was that those attempted cures more than likely just made the patient much weaker, and whatever illness or malady that they had, it would be just that much easier for that malady to kill them. So it often did more harm than good. Hospitals, they were terrible. Patients were just thrown together in crowded, filthy conditions, sometimes more than one to a bed. There wasn't any hygiene practice or fresh air. But in the late 18th and early 19th century, movements to reform hospitals started popping up in various European cities. Mental illness, you were treated like animals. The mentally ill were treated like animals. They were beaten, they were chained to walls and doused with cold water. Unbelievably cruel and inhumane treatment. Again, by the end of the 18th century and the beginnings of the 19th century, some moves are going to be made to try to reform in those areas as well. Okay, so that should give you an idea of the woeful state of medical practice going into the 19th century. All right, well, there were some improvements being made, as we mentioned. The spirit of the Enlightenment had something to do with it too. The idea that we try to look at illness and disease empirically and try to come up with solutions to those problems that were also based empirically, and then actually conduct experiments to see if those projected and hypothetical cures actually were valid. The big triumph that they had in the 18th century was dealing with smallpox, and we've mentioned this earlier this year. It started when the wife of the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire in the early 18th century, Lady Montagu, was with her husband at his posting in Constantinople, and the Ottomans were practicing inoculation against smallpox, and it seemed to work. And so she thought this would be something really useful to bring back to Britain and try there, and she was very influential in doing that. However, tough selling somebody on doing that, because you're actually opening the skin and inserting some of the pus from the pustule of a smallpox-infected person under the person you're inoculating skin. So there's chance, number one, of infection setting in, and number two, that you'd actually get the full-blown case of smallpox yourself. And, it was really tough to convince people to go. They'd be like, "You're going to give me smallpox on purpose? Huh? I don't think so." But by the end of the 18th century, there was an English physician by the name of Edward Jenner. And Edward Jenner realized, and we've talked about this, that by conducting experiments and doing empirical observation, that smallpox was very similar to the much less serious disease cowpox. Milkmaids out in the English countryside tended to not get smallpox. And it kind of was an old wives' tale that they were somehow immune to it. Well, it turned out it wasn't an old wives' tale. Jenner went out in the countryside, went around some farms, talked to and examined some milkmaids, and noticed they had sort of faint pockmark scars on their hands. Well, milking cows, they contracted cowpox. Turned out cowpox was enough like smallpox that if you had a case of cowpox, which was very much less serious than smallpox, you were just sick for a little while and then you got better. You were also not only immune to future episodes of cowpox, you were immune to smallpox as well. So Jenner got the idea that, well, it would be much less dangerous inoculation-wise to inoculate people with cowpox rather than, a live culture of smallpox. And that's what happened. And so Edward Jenner, by actually applying a scientific, experimental, empirical approach, is really, in many ways, the father of modern immunology. So smallpox, by 1796, he had performed the first successful inoculation against smallpox by using cowpox. Okay, well, a lot of health-related issues are going to become even more problematic in the 19th century with the onset of industrialization and with the just incredibly rapid growth of urban areas. Some of these industrial cities, especially first in Britain, grew so fast that the authorities and the powers that be in those urban areas had no way to get a handle on the rapid growth, and there was no way they could provide adequate services to these hugely mushrooming urban areas. So the crowding, the disease, the filth, that all was there before. It's just the Industrial Revolution in a lot of cities made it worse. And then you combine that with population growing, and population moving to the cities, and you got a recipe for some nasty conditions. So, in Britain, the percent of people living in urban areas of 20,000 or more people in 1801, even after a couple decades of industry, was 17%. Now that was high. That was high for the time. Most other countries were far more rural and agrarian than that. But in 90 years, that had pretty much tripled. And Britain, actually the majority of the population by the 1890s was living in urban areas. That happened probably first in the Netherlands and then in Britain. Poor housing, overcrowded housing, nasty living conditions. You got a serious public health problem on your hands. Okay? Maybe transportation developments would help in that you could spread people out from the industrial centers a little bit more and you wouldn't have the intense overcrowding. Maybe zoning laws, what we'd call zoning laws today, where you don't have a slaughterhouse 2 houses down the street from a tenement building where people are living, or a leather tannery. Really, we're going to see when they start to attack the problem in municipal services, that's when you're going to see some improvements. We'll come back in clip part 2 for assignment 13 and talk about that from there.